The airplane hummed softly as it cruised high above the clouds, the seatbelt sign flickering off with a gentle chime. Passengers settled in for the long journey ahead, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others adjusting their seats for a nap. The soft murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of drink glasses filled the air. Among the travelers sat an elderly black couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, elegantly dressed and carrying an air of quiet dignity. They had chosen to fly commercial that day, preferring to blend in rather than take their usual private jet. Mrs. Thompson adjusted her shawl and looked over at her husband, who seemed a little uncomfortable. "You feeling all right, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle. "A little parched," Mr. Thompson admitted, licking his dry lips. "Could use some water." Mrs. Thompson smiled and pressed the call button. A moment later, a flight attendant in a crisp uniform appeared. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read Emily. "Yes," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes flicking between them with a barely concealed impatience. "My husband isn't feeling well. Could we please have some water?" Mrs. Thompson asked kindly. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where other passengers were being served drinks. "Water service is in about 20 minutes, she said flatly. "You'll have to wait." Mrs. Thompson blinked, surprised. "He's feeling a bit dizzy. It's just a small cup of water." "I understand," Emily interrupted, her voice sharper this time. "But we have procedures. I can't just hand out drinks whenever someone asks." Mr. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife reached for his hand, sensing his unease. She turned back to Emily, her smile still in place, though a hint of steel now laced her voice. "We understand procedures, dear. But surely a sip of water isn't against policy." Emily's expression hardened. "Look, I don't make the rules. If I give you water now, then I'll have to do it for everyone who asks. Just wait like everyone else." Mrs. Thompson exhaled slowly, exchanging a glance with her husband. They had experienced this kind of treatment before. The subtle, dismissive tone, the unnecessary resistance over something so small. It wasn't about water. It was about something much bigger. Across the aisle, another passenger, a middle-aged woman, watched the exchange with wide eyes. "I just saw you give water to the man in 3B, she murmured, barely loud enough for Emily to hear. Emily stiffened. Her eyes darted toward the front of the plane, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. "That's different," she said quickly. "He's a frequent flyer. Priority passengers get." "Priority," Mrs. Thompson repeated, raising a brow. Emily swallowed but stood firm. "I need to get back to work." And with that, she turned on her heel and strode away, her posture rigid. A tense silence hung in the air. The passenger who had spoken up shook her head in disbelief, while Mrs. Thompson gently squeezed her husband's hand, her face unreadable. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, his voice quiet but firm. "Let it go, darling. Some people don't know who they're dealing with." His wife gave a small, knowing smile. "Not yet, anyway." And as the plane soared through the sky, completely unaware of the storm brewing within its cabin, Emily had no idea that the very people she had just dismissed so easily weren't just any passengers. They were the owners of the airline. And they weren't the kind of people to let things slide. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as Mrs. Thompson leaned back in her seat, her fingers gently tapping against the armrest. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was disappointed. After all these years, after everything they had built, it was still the same story. The same dismissiveness, the same quiet condescension masked as professionalism. She glanced at her husband, who closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. He had always been the calmer one, the one who believed patience and wisdom would eventually shift the tides. But Mrs. Thompson had never been one to wait. A few rows ahead, Emily moved swiftly through the aisle, her demeanor changing as she interacted with other passengers. She smiled warmly at a businessman in first class, refilling his drink without him even asking. She adjusted a blanket for a younger woman traveling with a baby, her tone gentle, almost sweet. Mrs. Thompson watched carefully. It wasn't a matter of company policy or strict regulations. It was a choice. Emily had made a choice to ignore their simple request, and that choice spoke volumes. The middle-aged woman across the aisle, who had spoken up earlier, leaned toward them slightly. "That was unbelievable," she murmured. "I've been on dozens of flights, and I've never seen a flight attendant refuse water like that. Are you both all right?" Mrs. Thompson turned her attention to her, offering a polite smile. "Oh, we're fine, dear," she said, her voice smooth and unbothered. "But thank you for speaking up." The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I just don't think it's right. And the way she was looking at you too. I don't know, it just felt," she stopped herself, lowering her voice. "Wrong." Mrs. Thompson let out a soft chuckle, though there was no real humor in it. "You have a good eye." The woman hesitated before offering her hand. "I'm Linda, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Linda." Mrs. Thompson shook her hand, then gestured toward her husband. "This is my husband, Charles." Mr. Thompson opened his eyes and nodded with a warm smile. "Pleasure." Linda looked like she wanted to say something more, but she hesitated. After a moment, she exhaled and shook her head. "I just don't understand people sometimes. Anyway, I hope she comes to her senses." Mrs. Thompson simply smiled. "Oh, I'm sure she will." Meanwhile, Emily continued down the aisle, her polished, professional demeanor never wavering. She was good at her job, at least, when she wanted to be. She had worked as a flight attendant for nearly 4 years now, and she had learned exactly how to handle passengers. Some were easy, some were demanding, and some just didn't belong in first class. She didn't think she had done anything wrong. There were policies, after all, and if she bent the rules for one person, where would it stop? Still, something about the way Mrs. Thompson had looked at her made her feel uneasy. There was no anger, no arguing, no raised voice. Just a quiet confidence that made Emily feel like she had made a mistake, though she wasn't sure why. As she reached the galley, she spotted another flight attendant, Mark, pouring a glass of champagne for a passenger in business class. "Busy today?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow as he handed off the drink. Emily sighed, rolling her shoulders. "You have no idea. First class is full of entitled passengers today." Mark let out a quiet laugh. "When isn't it?" Emily smirked, but her mind drifted back to the couple. Something about them felt different. She pushed the thought away and focused on her duties. But the uneasy feeling lingered. Back in their seats, Mr. Thompson slowly adjusted his watch, his movements deliberate. "How much longer is this flight?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Thompson glanced at the screen in front of her. "4 more hours." He sighed. "That's a long time to sit in disrespect." Mrs. Thompson smiled knowingly. "Patience, darling." She leaned back, crossing her legs as she watched the cabin with a practiced eye. She had spent decades in business, had met thousands of people, employees, executives, board members. She knew how to read a room. She also knew when someone had made a mistake they wouldn't be able to take back. Emily would realize that soon enough. A few minutes later, the drink service finally made its way through first class. A different flight attendant, an older man named Robert, stopped by their row with a warm smile. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked kindly. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, amused. "Oh, now we're allowed to have water?" Robert blinked, confused. "I'm sorry." Mr. Thompson gave him a small nod. "Your colleague, Emily, I believe, told us we had to wait." "That was quite a while ago." Robert's forehead creased slightly. "Oh, I see. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, as if debating whether to say something. Then, he quickly poured 2 glasses of water and handed them over. I do apologize for that. Please let me know if you need anything else. Mrs. Thompson accepted the glass with a polite nod. Thank you, Robert. You've been very kind. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. If there was an issue, I can. Oh, no need, she interrupted smoothly. We'll handle it. Robert hesitated again, but something in her tone told him to leave it alone. With a small nod, he moved on. Emily, who had been returning from the galley, caught sight of Robert handing them the drinks. Her jaw tightened. She had told them to wait. She had been firm. And now Robert had completely undermined her. She marched over, her smile strained. I thought I explained earlier that... Mrs. Thompson turned her head slightly, her expression still poised and calm. That we had to wait? Yes, you did. And we did. Emily's face flushed. Well, if you had just been patient. Patience isn't the issue, Mrs. Thompson said smoothly. Respect is. Emily opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. There was something about the way Mrs. Thompson looked at her, something unreadable, something powerful. Mr. Thompson, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. We understand rules, young lady. We've written quite a few of them ourselves. Emily frowned. What does that mean? Mrs. Thompson simply smiled and took a slow sip of her water. You'll find out soon enough. Emily's unease deepened. Something about the way Mrs. Thompson said it made her stomach turn. For the first time since the flight began, Emily started to wonder if she had made a mistake. A very big mistake. And as the plane continued its journey through the sky, she had no idea that her actions would soon come back to haunt her. The tension in the cabin was subtle but undeniable. Emily could feel it hanging in the air like an approaching storm. She tried to shake it off, to convince herself she had handled the situation correctly. After all, she was just doing her job. But something about the Thompsons' calm, almost amused demeanor unsettled her. She moved quickly through the aisle, stopping to refill drinks and collect empty glasses, but her mind kept drifting back to them. Their words replayed in her head. We've written quite a few rules ourselves. What did that even mean? She had assumed they were just another elderly couple traveling in first class, but something about them felt different. At the front of the cabin, Mark was chatting with Robert near the galley. He noticed Emily approaching and raised an eyebrow. Everything all right? Emily crossed her arms. Did you give water to the couple in 4A and 4B? Robert gave her a confused look. Yes. Why? Emily scoffed. Because I told them they had to wait. Robert frowned. You refused to give an elderly man water? It's not like that, Emily muttered. I was just following procedure. Mark let out a low whistle. Wow. That's not a great look. Emily shot him a glare. I don't need a lecture, Mark. Robert sighed. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and those passengers, but they didn't seem upset. Just expectant. Mark smirked. Expectant? Like waiting for something to happen? Robert hesitated. Kind of. It was the way she looked at me when I gave them the water. Like she already knew how this would play out. Emily stiffened. They're just passengers. Mark leaned against the counter, his expression amused. I don't know, Em. You might have picked the wrong people to mess with. Emily rolled her eyes. Oh, please. What are they going to do? Complain? Report me to corporate. Robert and Mark exchanged a glance, but neither said anything. Emily huffed and turned back toward the aisle, determined to shake off her growing unease. Meanwhile, back in their seats, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson remained perfectly composed, though an air of quiet understanding passed between them. Mrs. Thompson reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, her fingers gliding effortlessly across the screen. "Shall we check in?" she murmured. Mr. Thompson gave a slight nod. "Might as well." She tapped a few times, opening an encrypted communication app. It was a direct line to their executive team, something only a handful of people had access to. Within seconds, a message was sent. A few rows away, Linda watched them with growing curiosity. She still couldn't believe what had happened. It wasn't just about the water, it was the dismissive way Emily had handled it. The subtle way she had made it clear that she didn't think the Thompsons were worth the courtesy. Linda leaned over slightly. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you fly often?" Mrs. Thompson gave a knowing smile. "Quite often, yes." Linda hesitated, debating whether to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "You seemed very sure of yourself back there. Like you already knew how this was going to go." Mrs. Thompson chuckled. "Experience teaches you a lot." Linda tilted her head. "Experience? In what exactly?" Mr. Thompson glanced at his wife, amused. "Should we tell her?" Mrs. Thompson sighed dramatically. "Oh, I suppose. She seems like she can keep a secret." Linda's eyes widened slightly. Mrs. Thompson set her tablet down and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "We own this airline, dear." Linda blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Thompson smiled. "We are the majority shareholders. Every flight, every employee, every decision, it all comes through us at some point." Linda's mouth fell open slightly. She looked between them, trying to process what she had just heard. "And she had no idea?" Mrs. Thompson smirked. "Oh no, she had no idea." Linda let out a low whistle. "Well, this is about to get interesting." Across the aisle, Emily continued moving through the cabin, her confidence slowly returning. She convinced herself that she was overthinking things. The couple probably wouldn't even file a complaint. They were just an older pair of travelers who had been mildly inconvenienced. But she had no idea that, just a few rows away, her actions had already set something in motion. In a sleek corporate office thousands of miles away, a notification pinged on the screen of a man in an expensive suit. He picked up his phone, read the message, and immediately stood from his desk. He knew better than to ignore a direct request from the Thompsons. And he knew that someone, somewhere, had just made a very costly mistake. Emily moved through the aisle, straightening blankets and offering polite smiles to passengers, but her mind wasn't at ease. Something about the way Mrs. Thompson had spoken to her, the quiet certainty in her voice, lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't the usual frustration she was used to from passengers, it was something else, something she couldn't quite place. She glanced back at their seats. Mr. Thompson was reading, his expression calm, while Mrs. Thompson scrolled on her tablet, her fingers tapping deliberately against the screen. It was as if they weren't just waiting for the flight to land, they were waiting for something to happen. A sudden chime from the intercom broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and will be arriving at our destination in approximately 3 hours. We expect smooth skies ahead. Thank you for flying with us." Emily sighed in relief. Just a few more hours, and she'd be off this plane. She pushed her unease aside and continued with her duties, hoping that whatever strange feeling she had about this couple would pass. But she wasn't the only one feeling the tension. Linda, still stunned by the revelation that the Thompsons owned the airline, watched the flight attendant carefully. She could see the subtle changes in Emily's posture, the way her shoulders tensed when she passed by, the slight hesitation in her movements. She knew something was coming, and she wasn't going to miss a second of it. Meanwhile, in a sleek corporate office, a man in a dark suit tapped his fingers against his desk as he listened to the message he had received. His name was Richard Carlyle, and he was one of the highest-ranking executives in the company. A direct message from the Thompsons wasn't something to be taken lightly. He quickly pulled up the employee roster for the flight and scanned through the names. His eyes landed on Emily Carter. He clicked into her record, his expression unreadable as he reviewed her file. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. A woman in a sharp blazer stepped in, her face serious. "I just received the same message." Richard leaned back in his chair. "They didn't give details, but I have a feeling someone on that flight made a very bad decision." The woman nodded. "You know what this means, don't you?" Richard exhaled, already reaching for his phone. "Oh, I do. And by the time that plane lands, someone's going to wish they had been more careful." Back in the sky, Emily was finishing her final rounds when she noticed Robert giving her an odd look. "What?" she asked, folding her arms. Robert hesitated. "You sure you don't want to just apologize?" Emily scoffed. "For what?" "Enforcing policy." Robert sighed. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but something about them is different. And if I were you, I'd make things right before we land." Emily rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." But as she turned back to the cabin, she caught sight of Mrs. Thompson looking directly at her. Not glaring, not frowning, just watching. And suddenly, Emily wasn't so sure she was in control anymore. In the cockpit, the captain received a priority message from corporate. His brow furrowed as he read it. He wasn't used to getting direct communication from the highest levels of the company, but there was no mistaking the urgency in the message. A request had been made. A specific flight attendant needed to be spoken to before landing. And the person making the request was one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. The captain exhaled slowly. Whatever was happening, it was serious. Emily had no idea that her fate was already being decided. Emily continued moving through the cabin, but now, every step felt heavier. The weight of Mrs. Thompson's gaze still lingered, and Robert's words echoed in her mind. She wanted to dismiss it all, convince herself that this was just another flight, that nothing was out of the ordinary. But deep down, she knew something was off. She checked her watch. Less than 2 hours until landing. Just a little longer, and she could forget all about this strange encounter. She turned toward the galley, ready to grab a quick drink of water, when she noticed Mark staring at his phone with wide eyes. "What's up with you?" she asked, trying to shake off her own nerves. Mark didn't answer right away. He just held up his phone so she could see the screen. It was a message from a friend who worked in corporate. "Hey, are you on Flight 162? Something big is happening. There's a direct order from the top. I don't know what, but it involves a flight attendant. Just a heads up, things might get messy when you land." Emily's stomach twisted. "That could mean anything," she said, forcing a laugh. "Maybe someone on board is causing trouble." Mark gave her a pointed look. "Or maybe someone already did." Emily's pulse quickened, but she refused to let the panic show. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, brushing past him. But the unease had fully settled in now, and ignoring it was no longer an option. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson remained relaxed in their seats, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. But behind that calm exterior, things were already in motion. A second message had been sent. This time, it wasn't just to corporate. It was to someone on the ground. Someone who had the power to make decisions immediately. At that very moment, inside the VIP lounge at the airport, a senior operations manager named Daniel Rivera looked down at his phone. His expression hardened as he read the message. There was no mistaking it. The order was clear. He picked up his radio and signaled to the ground crew. "I need security at Gate 14 upon arrival. And notify the regional director. This is coming from the highest level." The crew on the other end hesitated. "Is this about a passenger?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "No. It's about a crew member." Back in the sky, Emily's nerves were unraveling fast. She walked back to the galley, gripping the counter as she tried to steady herself. Breathe. Stay calm. This is just in your head. But then the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing. Emily let out a slow breath. It was almost over. But as she stepped back into the aisle to complete her final checks, she noticed something strange. Mrs. Thompson had put away her tablet and was now watching her again. Except this time, she wasn't alone. Several first-class passengers, including Linda, were also looking in Emily's direction. Their expressions weren't angry, but they weren't exactly neutral either. It was as if they knew something she didn't. Emily swallowed hard. What is going on? She turned to Mark, but before she could say anything, he nudged his head toward the front of the cabin. Captain wants to see you. Emily froze. What? Mark's face was unreadable. Now. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the cockpit. She knocked lightly, and the door opened just enough for her to step inside. The captain was seated, his eyes fixed on a message displayed on the control panel. He didn't look angry, but there was a seriousness in his expression that sent a shiver down her spine. He turned to her. Emily, is there something you need to tell me? She frowned. I don't understand. The captain studied her for a moment, then sighed. When we land, security will be waiting. There's an order from corporate to speak with you immediately. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The captain continued, his voice steady but firm. I don't know what this is about, but I do know that I've never seen an executive order come in mid-flight like this. He paused. Whatever happened back there? I hope it was worth it. Emily felt the floor drop out from under her. This wasn't just a complaint. This wasn't just a bad interaction. This was something much, much bigger. And the moment they landed, she would have to face it. As the plane descended, Emily felt like she was trapped in slow motion. Every second felt stretched, every glance from a passenger felt heavier. She kept telling herself that this was all a misunderstanding, that it couldn't possibly be as bad as it seemed. Maybe it was just protocol. Maybe corporate had overreacted. But deep down, she knew better. The wheels touched down with a smooth jolt, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, her palms grew sweaty. She stole a glance at Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, but they were calm, quietly gathering their things. No anger. No gloating. Just waiting. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, the first-class cabin erupted into movement. Passengers stood, stretching, reaching for their bags. But before Emily could turn away, Mark touched her arm, his voice low. They're here. Emily's stomach twisted. She turned toward the front of the cabin and spotted two men in suits standing just outside the aircraft door. Behind them, a woman in an airline operations uniform held a clipboard, her expression unreadable. The air felt thick as passengers began filing out. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were among the last to rise, moving unhurriedly toward the exit. As they reached the door, Mrs. Thompson turned her head slightly and gave Emily a polite nod. That simple gesture sent a chill through her. Then they were gone. Emily's breath quickened as one of the suited men stepped forward, looking directly at her. Emily Carter? She nodded, her voice barely coming out. Yes. I'm with the executive office. We need to speak with you. Please follow us. Mark and Robert exchanged worried glances, but neither said a word as Emily slowly stepped forward, her legs feeling unsteady. She followed the men through the jet bridge, past curious airport staff, and into a quiet conference room near the gate. The woman with the clipboard entered behind them, closing the door firmly. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, one of the men set a file down on the table and folded his hands. Do you know who owns this airline? Emily felt her throat tighten. I don't. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Thompson at a corporate event, standing in front of the airline's logo. Emily's heart dropped. "You denied water to the owners of this airline," the man said evenly. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. "The Thompsons are very hands-on with their company. They prefer to see firsthand how their airline operates. They value respect and fairness." She paused. "And unfortunately, what happened today does not align with those values." Emily's chest tightened. I didn't know." "Exactly." The man leaned forward. "And that's the problem." Emily's mind raced. Was she about to be fired? Suspended? She wanted to plead her case, to explain that she had just been following policy, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the full truth. She had judged them, assumed they weren't important, and now she was paying the price. She braced herself for the inevitable. But then, the man exhaled and sat back. "Here's the thing," he said. "The Thompsons aren't asking for you to be fired." Emily blinked. "They're not." The woman shook her head. "No. They believe in second chances." Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The man slid another piece of paper across the table. "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to mandatory retraining. You'll be placed under direct supervision to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Emily swallowed hard. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it was humiliating. She had worked for years to build her reputation, and now she was being sent back to square one. She lowered her head. "I understand." The man studied her for a moment, then stood. "One more thing." She looked up. "Mrs. Thompson left a message for you." Emily's breath hitched. He handed her a small folded note. With shaky fingers, she opened it and read the handwritten words inside. "Kindness is free. Always remember that." Emily's eyes burned as she closed the note. Without another word, the executives gathered their things and exited the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She had spent the entire flight convinced that she was the one with power, the one making the rules. But in the end, she had been the one taught a lesson. And she knew she would never forget it. Emily sat in the empty conference room for a long time, staring at the note in her hands. The words echoed in her mind, over and over. "Kindness is free." It was such a simple statement, yet it carried more weight than anything she had read before. She exhaled slowly, trying to process everything that had just happened. She had walked onto that flight feeling like she had authority, like she understood how things worked. Now, she was walking away with a hard lesson in humility. The very people she had dismissed, the ones she had treated as unimportant, turned out to be the ones with the most power. But they hadn't chosen revenge. They had chosen to teach her something instead. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Mark standing there, looking hesitant. "Hey," he said, stepping inside. "I, heard what happened." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "Yeah. It wasn't exactly how I thought this day would go." Mark pulled up a chair across from her, hesitating before speaking. "You okay?" She let out a weak laugh. "I don't know. I mean, I'm not fired. But retraining? Supervision? It's embarrassing." She shook her head. "I worked so hard to get here. And now, I have to prove I deserve it all over again." Mark leaned back, thinking for a moment. "You know, it could have been worse." Emily shot him a look. "Worse?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "They could have made sure you never worked for this airline again. Or worse, they could have made an example out of you publicly. But they didn't." Emily sighed, looking down at the note again. "I don't get it. If they own the airline, if they have that much power, why not just fire me and be done with it?" Mark gave her a small smile. "Maybe because they're the kind of people who believe in giving others a chance to grow." The words sank in slowly, settling in the back of her mind. She had spent so much time assuming power meant control. But Mr. and Mrs. Thompson had shown her a different kind of power, one that came with wisdom and restraint. For the first time since the flight began, she felt something unexpected. Gratitude. She stood up, smoothing out her uniform. "I should probably go," she said, forcing a small smile. "I have a lot to think about." Mark nodded. "Yeah. And maybe next time, you'll think twice before judging someone based on how they look." Emily didn't argue. She simply nodded, accepting the truth in his words. As she left the room and walked through the airport, she felt the eyes of other staff members on her. The news had clearly spread fast. But she didn't let it get to her. Not this time. Instead of heading straight home, she made her way to the airline's corporate office, where retraining sessions were scheduled. She checked in at the front desk, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. It was humbling to sit among trainees, listening to lessons she thought she had already mastered. Customer service, inclusivity, the importance of empathy. All things she should have understood better. And yet, here she was, relearning what should have been common sense. The days turned into weeks, and Emily found herself growing in ways she never expected. She started paying attention to small details, how people were treated, how she interacted with passengers, how easily bias could creep into everyday decisions. She watched how senior flight attendants handled tough situations, how they diffused conflicts with kindness instead of strict enforcement. And then, one day, something happened that changed everything. She was assigned to another first-class cabin on a different flight. This time, as she walked through the aisle, she noticed an elderly man and woman sitting quietly. They reminded her of the Thompsons, well-dressed, dignified, patient. A flight attendant near her was about to pass them by when the woman hesitantly raised her hand. "Excuse me, dear. May I have some water?" The other flight attendant hesitated for just a moment, barely noticeable, but enough for Emily to catch it. Before anything else could happen, Emily stepped forward with a warm smile. "Of course, ma'am. I'll bring it right away." The woman beamed at her. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you." Emily nodded, moving quickly to get the water. As she handed it over, she caught the way the elderly woman's eyes softened, as if she knew this small gesture meant something more. And in that moment, Emily knew it too. She had changed. It wasn't about rules or policies anymore. It wasn't about who had power and who didn't. It was simply about treating people with the respect they deserved. As she continued working flights, she made sure every passenger, no matter who they were, felt seen. She went out of her way to be kinder, to listen more, to remember that no one's worth could be determined just by looking at them. And though she never saw Mr. and Mrs. Thompson again, their lesson stayed with her. Because kindness was free. And now, she made sure to give it away as often as she could.